Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You can also become a bitter pill or what have you by visiting thebittertruth.info, which is the website for the show. We've got the Patreon link there. We appreciate any support. If you don't want to be a subscriber to Patreon, you can buy some of the cool stuff that we have on the tiers separately and just have the T-shirt or whatever you want and go from there. Appreciate the support as always. Today, we've got a guest on the show, been on before, author, essayist, and Dartmouth professor of Jewish studies, Shaul Magid. He's written a couple of books and always happy to make his acquaintance. How are you, man?
Great. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, thanks for coming on. So let's just kind of jump into it. I mean, I know we were talking a little bit between emails, but and I don't think most Americans kind of understand or know the significance of some of these new peace deals in the Middle East with Israel. I get emails sometimes during this last month or so going, see, Trump is trying to make peace. I'm going, well, to me, the Arab League is no different than the OAS, and the deals that they're making are just, nice cash guarantees. They don't seem to, or business guarantees. They don't seem to be anything terribly ethical or, based on any sort of moral standing. I mean, am I wrong about that? Or what are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think that well, there are a number of things happening simultaneously, and they're all kind of interwoven with one another. One is the Kushner peace plan, which was unveiled about half a year ago, and it didn't really go anywhere for obvious reasons that we can talk about. Sure. And then there was this other move, which is actually related to that plan, which is creating the conditions for normalized relations between Israel and a number of other Arab countries. Now, people talk about it in terms of peace in the Middle East, but the truth is, it's not really the normalizing relations with the UAE and the Bahrain, and now with the Sudan, specifically with the UAE and Bahrain, are not peace deals because those countries were never at war with Israel.
Yeah,
right. It really is basically about normalizing relations that have been actually ongoing informally for years. I mean, Israel has been dealing with Bahrain and the UAE for years. There was just no kind of formal recognition. So in a certain way, you could say on one level, okay, Israel is in a difficult situation in the region. Countries normalizing relations with Israel is certainly Arab countries normalizing relations with Israel is a good thing. There's nothing bad about it. The problem I find with it is like what it's really a piece of, and that's the problem. And the problem is that for a long time. Well, let me start this way. There are really three major parties in this whole Middle East crisis. There's Israel, the Palestinians, and the Arab countries. And then the United States and the EU and China and Russia, they're kind of like outlying, mediating influences. So there are the three pieces. And it was always thought that the three pieces were intertwined. That is, Israel couldn't make peace with the Arab countries if they didn't make peace with the Palestinians.
Right.
And they couldn't make peace with the Palestinians if they didn't make peace with the Arab countries. So basically, Netanyahu had really started to engage in this process of trying to normalize relationships with the Arab countries by circumventing the Palestinian question. So let's separate the two. Let's first actually deal with normalized relations with Arab countries, and then we can deal with the Palestinian problem. No one really thought that was a good idea for a variety. I shouldn't say that. Certainly, Netanyahu.
Well, the Israelis, right.
The Israelis thought it was a good idea. And the Israelis thought it was a good idea because they understood that by normalizing the relationships with Arab countries, it would give them leverage to put pressure on the Palestinians to accept a deal that they knew the Palestinians would never accept, which is whatever kind of denuded state or whatever it was going to be. Mm-hmm. So that was the basic plan. So none of the other larger parties of the United States, the EU, China, Russia, no one really actually bought into that. That's what the Kushner plan is basically suggesting. Mm-hmm. Let's leave the Palestinians out. Let's normalize relationships with certain Arab countries. And by doing that, we increase the leverage that when Israel then turns to the Palestinians, they have the UAE and they have Sudan and they have Bahrain behind them, and hopefully from the Israeli perspective, more countries behind them. And it would be a stronger case to make. Now, the the difficulty is that, first of all, it's clever, but I don't really think it's going to work for a variety of reasons.
Well, I mean, before you jump into those reasons, I mean, to piggyback on a point you made a second ago, not talking about the Palestinians. In Egypt did this too in the 70s with Menachem Begin. It's like, if you make a deal and not have the Palestinians in the equation, that's the elephant in the room. That's doing Hamlet without Hamlet. Right. A large part of the upset in the Middle East, we talked about this last time you were on. I mean, a bunch of rabbis in the early 1900s had a Ersatz white paper on the very subject. If you have a secular Israel, you're not going to really have peace in the region, because you're displacing somebody to make an Israel. And, the somebodies had been there for quite a few thousand years. I mean, so, that being said, again, these deals, UAE, Bahrain, they've already had these normalized relations, like you said. They are now making them formal as a way to use it but it just seems to me the simplest thing to do would be to, and I want to get into the rest of these because I got questions about the Sudan too. I mean, they just had to pay $355 million in reparations for an embassy bombing in 1998. And I'm like, well, weren't we bombing you for 10 fucking years? How about we split the difference? Right. Come to the table, make a deal with Israel, and we'll just split the difference and stop bombing you and not make you pay any money from something from 22 years ago when we killed way more than anybody at an embassy. But it just seems like it's just like you said, it's a tricky bargaining chip, and we don't. The simplest thing to do, because you said it before on the show when you came on a few months back, there's no two-state solution. That's a myth. So just have right to return. Come on back. Give the Palestinians that actually lost land reparations and let them buy property. I mean, we don't do that to blacks in this country technically, right. American Indians technically. Jews in Iran have a better situation than Palestinians in Israel. That's just a fact.
There are just so few of them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they're still the largest population outside of Israel in the Middle East. So and there's no torturing. They got synagogues. They got Jewish delis. They can drink the wine and do what they got to do. And they don't get screwed with it. So coming into this, moving forward, like for example, the deal with the Sudan, now that there's 3 down, do you think that what's going to happen with Oman and, Saudi Arabia? I mean, Saudi Arabia is the big jewel, right?
Right. Saudi Arabia is the big jewel. And I think I do want to make a distinction. I think Camp David won in 1979, which was the peace agreement with Egypt. That was really of a different order, because Egypt was at that time the most powerful Arab country in the world. It's not anymore, but it was then.
Right.
And it was also proximate neighbors to Israel. So for Begin and Sadat to actually, end the state of war, for Sadat to fly to Jerusalem, that was a big thing, right? That was
I know.
Really big, right? And even though you're right, the Palestinians were left out of it. But remember, that was 1979. It was only really about 12 years after the beginning of the occupation. Anyway, the settlement enterprise was not nearly what it is now. It really started to really get going in 77 when Begin was elected. So it was of a different order. The thing with, this is the thing what I find to be troubling about the Kushner thing. See, Kushner is a businessman, right? So he basically, his basically operating principle is everybody has a price. All you have to do is find what the price is. In a certain sense, that's how real estate works. That's how business goes. That's basically how he approaches geopolitical diplomacy. If I can find the right price for the UAE, if I can give them the right planes so that they'll feel protected against Iran, what do they care about Israel? Israel is 6,000 miles away. It has nothing to do with the Gulf states, right? So in a way, they were the slow swimming fish. They were the easy catch in a way to go to Bahrain, because in a certain sense, the UAE said, we get the fighter jets. We can protect ourselves against the Shia in Iran. That's what we want. Recognizing Israel doesn't really do that much, because we've been relating to them anyway.
Right.
So you're right. Obviously, if Saudi Arabia actually goes in that direction, that would be a big thing. But I don't think that they will. They initially said, after the Bahrain deal, Saudi Arabia said there's no formal recognition of Israel until the Palestinian issue is solved. Now, the question about how the Arab world relates to the Palestinians is a very, very interesting one. And Rashid Khalidi wrote a book about that. And I think that the Kushner plan and the Kushner project is really making a certain kind of determination that the Arabs will be willing to throw the Palestinians under the bus for the right price.
Oh, hell, oh, dude, my dad's Palestinian. I've been watching this shit my whole life, and I got no emotional dog in this fight. I'm not going to go back to there to retire. I don't care. I can only stay 90 days if I go back and see relatives. I'm in there 30 years. I was there 3 weeks before. No emotional tie to this whatsoever. I just can't look at it and ignore it and go bitch about Venezuela.
Right.
Right. That's just my philosophy. But to your point though, see, this is the thing that pisses me off is that, like, for example, Iran. When was the last time Iran attacked the UAE or even saber rattled Bahrain? Right? Iran doesn't do jack shit. They're just a boogeyman because they're not on the dollar. That's the only reason why we keep going after them. Right. And we support 73% of the world's dictators. So, we worry about the freedoms of other countries. It's almost a bullshit canard. Yeah. So here's the rub. Here's the interesting rub, right? So let's say, hopefully by next week, the Kushner plan will be history, but let's just say it goes forward. Right. So what happens if the Arab world begins to recognize Israel without Israel doing anything vis-a-vis the Palestinian question, right? So basically, it goes back to what Marwan Barghouti said almost 3 decades ago, when he basically said, look, the situation is as follows. The Palestinians always have the ace in the hole. They can always just say, we don't want a state, we want to vote. Right. They can just basically do that. And once they do that, it's a game changer. So in a sense, you could say, okay, Netanyahu wants to do everything that he wants to do in order to gain leverage to give the Palestinians the minimal amount that he can. But if the Palestinians say no, you can't force a state on a population that doesn't want to accept it. Right. And if the Palestinians just say, okay, we give up our state, we just want to be a part of the Israeli democracy, then Israel has to say, no, well, we can't do that either. Because that would then, change the demographics and ruin the whole kind of Jewish majority. So in a certain sense, it's a very dangerous game that's being played. Right, but this is my challenge to all of this. If your government is so whiz bang awesome, then you don't have to worry about Palestinians having rights. If you're so strong and awesome, you don't have to worry about it. If you're really God's people and all that bullshit, I'm not religious, so I don't care. Then you have to worry about it because God's got your back, right? Just David and Goliath and all that crap. If that's real. So, well,
there are those that Moshe Aarons used to say that. He used to say basically, let's annex the West Bank, give everybody there a vote, and let the chips fall where they may. And this is a guy who was a secular Zionist, right? And there are a lot of people that make that claim. There's a couple of problems with that. One of them is obviously what that would mean in terms of a majority. Second of all, Israel also has thousands of Israelis who move to the diaspora every year, right? So there's movement from Israel into the diaspora, therefore slightly lowering their own population. Sure. And a fewer number of Palestinians are actually moving to the diaspora for all kinds of reasons, economic reasons, whatever. Sure. So, it's everybody is saying, "Oh, isn't this great? Isn't this great?" It's if you look down the road, even if it's successful, it's not that great because eventually, the thing, when I talk about this, I say, look, the only way to solve this, there's only one route to solve it, and that's through Ramallah. You can't do it through Bahrain, you can't do it through UAE, you can't do it through Sudan, you can't even do it with Saudi Arabia. You have to go through Ramallah. You have to deal with the Palestinian question and the question of statehood or not statehood and what that actually means. Right. And I think what Kushner and Friedman. Because look, Friedman was a supporter of the settlers from before he became part of the Trump administration. Sure. It's very clear, right? So when Aaron David Miller, who was a part of Camp David too, and all those things, he basically wrote an essay and he said he gave 5 points of advice to Kushner, and Kushner didn't take any of them. But one of them is very important, and the important one piece of advice, he said, whatever you do, do not look like Israel's lawyer. Because once you do that, it's game over. Right. And Kushner, that's exactly what the Kushner plan is. What does it mean to create some kind of a peace plan to the Israel-Palestinian issue and not invite the Palestinians to the negotiating table? Well, what does that actually?
It means nothing. It means what what U.S. policy has been since Britain lost control of the entire practice. Right? It's been a pro-Israel lobby result, and to even 12-year-olds aren't fooled by this. Right? Like I used to get in fights all the time in junior high school. So if I had to go before Mr. Breedice, my counselor, right, with the other guy that we were fighting with, he didn't talk to that guy by himself and leave me in the hallway, right? He put me in the room with the guy, right? And he told us why he was suspending the both of us, right? So you can't just discuss this without the other party involved, which is what we've been doing with this issue for at least 50 years. And you, as you said, and then go back to the Sadat question. He wasn't ever going to bring up the Palestinians because the money was too good. Him and Jordan are paid to be nice, right? And Mubarak was on the same deal. They're not bosom buddies with these guys. It was a deal, which is fine. You make peace with your enemies, make deals with your friends. I get that, but ethically, I don't think it's even remotely sound to leave the Palestinians out of it. Right. And then, like, for example, you get into Sudan. That's the Sudan deal. They're paying reparations. They're paying reparations. If they're paying reparations, they should make the Palestinian question an issue. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the analogy that I use is that it's like a couple is getting divorced, and the husband basically hires a high-powered lawyer, and then the high-powered lawyer goes and hires his business partner as a judge. And the three of them, and they don't bring the wife into the room, and the three of them sit and work out a divorce agreement, and then they go to the wife and they say, "Here it is, take her to leave it."
Right.
Like who would actually approve such a thing? That's kind of what happened. Now, to be fair, when Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which he really actually didn't do, the embassy is not. I mean, the big fancy building that he promised never came about. But let's just say that move to Jerusalem, which was symbolic, and every president from Nixon onward didn't do it for all kinds of reasons, good reasons.
Sure, right.
Okay. So they did that. So the Palestinians said basically cut off kind of contact with the United States. And then the United States basically cut off all its aid to the Palestinians.
Right.
So people will say, oh, well, the Palestinians, they cut off contact with America after Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem. But it all doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Do you want a solution to the problem, or do you not want a solution to the problem? Right. If you want a solution to the problem, all of the parties have to be present.
Right.
Otherwise, look, here, this is my take on it. I think a lot, like Netanyahu and certainly the Likud government and many in Israel, basically begin with what is, to me, an untenable assumption. The untenable assumption is all of the land from the river to the sea is ours. And if you're good, we'll give you a piece of it. Mm-hmm. It's a chauvinistic approach.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Right. And once you start with that approach, like it's all ours, and if you're good boys, we'll give you a piece of it. You can't, ultimately you can't, you're not going to be able to create a solution to the problem.
Right.
Now, it could be true that the Palestinians make the same claim. Right. The difference is the Palestinians really don't have any power
at all. I mean, I remember when I was in college, my last name is Abdelhadi, right? And I didn't know this, but this happened to me a few times when I was in school. I had a computer class or sociology class. And after the first day of class, because my real name is Ibrahim, it's not Abe, right? So the guy would say my real name, and I was like, hey, here I am. And a couple of guys would come trailing after me. And they're, hey, Abdelhadi. And I'm like, yeah. And apparently there's some famous family in Jordan with the same last name. We are not related to them at all. So the joke I started making after the second, I asked my dad about that. He goes, oh yeah. There's this family in Oman. They're a big deal. And I go, oh, are we related? He goes, nah. So the joke I started making was, yeah, those guys are in oil. We're in sheep. So we're not related. Sorry to burst your bubble, but
look.
But the look on their face, though, it was like crestfallen. They would be sad for me because, like, oh, my dad's Palestinian, and they go, oh, it's like they're the West. It's like they're the wetback of the Middle East. Like they really are. Like nobody likes them. The Arabs don't like them because it's a thorn in their side for money. Like you said, there's a price. They fuck with that price.
Yeah.
And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you tell, this is a theory. I think the reason why the Saudis is such a holdout, and until there's a solution, quote unquote, to this question, because they got Mecca and Medina, right? They are the last arbiter of Islam. And if you sell out to Israel for money, wouldn't that look bad? I mean, wouldn't that look just bad PR, right?
Yeah, I think so, but they also have a lot of economic concerns. I mean, they see the way in which oil is starting to become less and less essential on the world market, and people are dealing with alternative energies. In other words, they're very smart. They're able to see a few generations ahead, and they see that the resource that they have that makes them as rich as they are is simply not going to be as valuable in 100 years as it is now. So they're also planning for the future in some way. You're right. So then it's really the nexus of the economics and religion, which in a certain way is what the Middle East has been about. Sure. I just think that there's a certain my take on the Kushner thing is that it's really it's not a peace plan really, but it's a proposal that's built on a kind of cynical capitalism. Right? That's what Kushner is. He's a businessman, right? So you basically you say, like, we're going to sell people out. People want this. We're going to give them this. And the truth is, if you think about it, Israel got relations with the UAE and with Bahrain, and they gave nothing. They were asked to give nothing.
Right.
Zero, right?
Right.
So in a way, that's the success from the Kushner perspective, and from the Netanyahu perspective, that's success. Now, the problem is that Israelis and Palestinians, their attitudes are changing towards this whole thing as well.
Sure.
I mean, now we're somewhere in the 40s among Jewish Israelis polled in terms of whether they're in favor of two states anyway. So, and we were talking about last time I was on about the fact that two states is basically an anachronism at this point.
Absolutely.
So you're dealing with one state, and basically the price that's being paid by the success of the Kushner plan is Israel's democracy.
Right. Well, and by definition, they're not a democracy. They're no different of a theocracy than Iran is. Right. Judaism is the official religion. Hebrew is the official language. They declare themselves the Jewish state. That's not a democracy. That's a theocracy. And by definition, you're shutting out people in the process who aren't Jewish.
Right. Well, they asked Ahmad Tibi, who is the longest standing, at this point, I think is the longest standing Knesset member of the Arab Party. They asked him, is Israel a democracy? And he says, he had a great answer. He said, what was his response? I forgot at this point what his response was. He said, if you're an Israeli, if you're a Jewish Israeli, it's a democracy. If you're an Arab, it's a Jewish state.
Well, yeah, that's pretty, and that's it. And so, and then and even though they're a parliament, and they got these different parties, most of the Israeli parties are pretty right wing, are they not?
At this point, even what were called the centrist parties are now pretty right wing.
Yeah,
the left has really just collapsed, and the third largest party in the country is the Arab bloc.
Right, and that's only about 10-12% of the parliament, right?
Right, but it's interesting because the Arab bloc is voting in much higher numbers, and there are more and more Jewish Israelis that are actually voting with the Arab bloc for a variety of reasons.
Oh, wow.
Look, I will say that I think it's worth saying. Look, this has always been the case. This has always been the case in Israel from the beginning. Is it going to try to normalize itself in the Arab world, or is it going to tie itself to the United States or Russia or whatever it's going to be? And I think that there were Zionists in the early 20th century that were saying against Ben Gurion, because Ben Gurion wanted to tie Israel's wagon to the U.S. first to Russia, then
absolutely.
US. And then you had a lot of people saying, no, you gotta normalize yourself in the region. You can't be a pariah stuck in the middle of a region.
Right.
So I think that even though Camp David won with Egypt is certainly a cold peace, it's not a warm peace, but it is a peace of sorts. I think normalizing relationships with Israel's proximate neighbors is important, but not at the expense of the Palestinian question, because that's the albatross, and you're never going to get that off your neck by normalizing relationships with the UAE and the Bahrain. And it's not even a beginning, really. It's the idea of circumventing the Palestinians on this question, I think, was a big mistake.
Well, and then let me ask you really quickly, because we got some time. I mean, there's a couple of other players. Morocco's still holding out, and they got an issue with the Western Sahara, right? So it's like, and do they matter? Oman's pretty chill. They've got the Abdelhadi sect. That's most of Oman. So they're not like Sunni or Shia. They're pretty neutral, right? And if I'm not mistaken, I think their 2010 or 11 constitution recognizes Judaism in Oman, right? So it's not as though these two countries are even remotely a threat to Israel. Normalizing relationships, I don't think they even have. I don't even know if they even deal with Israel, do they? Oman or Morocco?
I don't know. I mean, look, what they do formally and what they do secretly, we don't.
Sure.
I mean, we did know that Israel had informal relations with the UAE and Bahrain, UAE for sure, for years. So you're right. But as you said, there are, in the Arab world, there are a few very big players that matter. Saudi Arabia, still Egypt, Jordan, because of the proximity. And those, I really, I don't think those people are going to basically sell out for
Lebanon won't.
10 talents of silver or whatever it is.
Yeah, Lebanon won't. Syria won't. Right. Especially what we've been doing in Syria. There's no fucking way they're going to come to the table.
Right. So, in a certain sense, look, politics is obviously a part of this, and everybody wanted to make the case that Trump is the only one that was ever going to break through. And people have been saying, "Oh, Kushner did what nobody else could do," but he didn't do what no one else could do because he didn't
do anything.
The Palestinian issue, right? I mean, he basically tried to circumvent it. So that doesn't what's going to be produced? That we're now going to allow flights that are going to fly from Ben Gurion Airport to the UAE. Okay, I guess for certain businessmen that's probably good.
Sure.
And I think that there will probably be economic benefits to both countries. Israel can sell computer chips to Bahrain, and Bahrain can sell whatever they're going to sell to Israel. So on that level, it's good. But the albatross is still around Israel's neck. That's the final thing. And I think that trying to circumvent that is not productive.
Well, and that seems to be the $64 question, because I mean, every cycle, 2 years ago, this cycle, 16, 14, I see it every time. Like pretty much every politician in the United States gets up in front of AIPAC and kisses massive ass and says, "Yeah, hey, Israel, right to defend itself." Well, that's a stupid phrase. Everybody has a right to defend themselves, including the goddamn Palestinians. So it's like that's like a nothing phrase. And when you see what AIPAC can do, they're a bigger lobby than the NRA. It's a fact. And they primary people. If you don't play ball with them, they will primary you ahead of the Democrats, ahead of the Republicans. They will ruin your career. And these guys know that. And so it's a total bought and paid for deal. And then I get frustrated when I see shit like I go to the grocery store at my house here and I see Israeli couscous, right? Well, last I checked, we got Chinese food in this country. We don't call it American food. It's Chinese food, right? Mm-hmm. We got Mexican food. We don't call it American food. We call it Chinese food, especially when Israel's founded by a bunch of Ashkenazi, Ukrainian, Romanian guys, right? White people who haven't been in that region for thousands of years, if ever. And now they're going to sit there and start co-opting, wedding dresses and and all that bullshit that my aunts do at weddings, right? And calling it Israeli hummus. It's not. I got in a big ass argument with a Mediterranean deli guy in Hollywood about 20 years ago. And it was hilarious because I was waiting for my food and we just started talking. He saw my credit card and he goes, "Oh, Abdelhadi." I go, "Yeah." Start telling me whatever. And he starts telling me, "Well, then this food is ours." No, it's not. You white Ashkenazi fuck. It's not ours. It's theirs. And you don't give me this co-opting crap and make it sound like you're normal. You're not. You haven't been there for thousands of years. You've been there since 1948. So blah, it's like we don't do that with the Mexicans or the Chinese in this country. Why are we doing with the goddamn Palestinians and calling it, Israeli this, Israeli that? I don't call it Palestinian matzo ball soup. When I go to a Jewish deli, when I go to Nate and Al's in Beverly Hills or Factors, I get gefilte fish because I like gefilte fish. It's kosher sardines to me, and I like it. And all my friends that were raised with it hate it, but I eat it and I put it on my Caesar salad. And they think I'm crazy. but I don't call it Palestinian gefilte fish. It's gefilte fish, right? I don't know, man. It's just
look. I think in my view, what has to happen is some of the people who really have the voice have to get up. And I would say this about someone like Jeremy Ben-Ami and J Street and people like that.
Sure.
Basically, have to say, look, we can't keep talking about the two-state solution. Forget it. Let's get over it. Let's talk about something else. Let's shift the paradigm. If you want to talk about shifting paradigms, right, the shifting paradigms is not making peace with Oman and the UAE and the Emirates. The shifting paradigm is saying that the two-state solution is not going to happen. And we have to talk about, how the Palestinians are going to be integrated into Israeli society, because that's the society that they live in. And this is something that Ian Lustig, in his book that we talked about last time, was made a very strong case for. This is something that that Meron Ben-Venisti, who was a deputy mayor of Jerusalem, who just passed away, he's been talking about this for years. We have to get past the two-state solution in order to be able to really think about these issues. The fascinating thing about the history of the two-state solution, which somebody has to actually write, is the two-state solution was something that was being propagated by the left in the beginning, and now in the last 15 years, it's starting being propagated by the right, and not the left, right? All of a sudden, AIPAC is on the two-state solution wagon. They weren't on the two-state solution wagon 25 years ago. So, and in part because I think they realize that it's not going to happen.
Well, that was my next point, because last time you were on the show, and in your article, which is how we got connected through our friend Mike, I mean, you made a brilliant point that the two-state solution is a nice canard for liberal Zionists to feel good about themselves and sleep better at night, because at least they're about a two-state solution, which is almost like riding the Santa Claus at this point, right? But it's a nice thing to say, but and especially in America, they don't even know what the fuck it means. They just think it's a nice thing to say, but it is dead.
Right. Well, because, and I will say, and I said it, I think last time too, in 1973 and 1974, when certain Jewish American groups were getting up and talking about the two-state solution, they were pummeled by the American Jewish community as being blasphemous, right?
Yeah.
So that turn is fascinating how that happened. But that would be a real paradigm change. And I think it's happening. It's happening from below. It's happening among younger groups that are basically trying to think their way out of a two-state solution and what one state would look like. And questions of democracy. I mean, this is a big thing.
It is a big thing.
Because this is what's at stake. Look, I don't think Israel's survival is at stake. I think Israel, like all countries, Israel will survive. Whether it's going to survive as a democracy is not clear.
Sure, but then, and we got some time here for a second, but see, that's the challenge. Is I'm not, I don't worry about their survival. When I ask this question, it's about, do you want peace? Period. And if you don't deal with the Palestinians, you'll never have peace. As long as Gaza is an open air prison, and you're counting calories and depriving medicine and food and lobbing bombs and mowing the lawn anytime you fucking feel like it, like Benny Gantz, then, back in 2014 and 2008 and all these other times, then you won't have peace. There is no peace. I mean, you have a bunch of blinder or people wearing blinders. I remember a couple of years back, I was in LA visiting, and I don't know what you call him, a born again Jew or something. I mean, like, he came from a pretty reformed family, but he kind of resented it, so he got super hardcore right wing. And we were out with some people, and he was just like, "Well, have you ever been back there?" I go, "Well, I was in the West Bank 25, 30 years ago. I didn't get the AIPAC Tel Aviv tour, where some supermodel blows me and feeds me a Bloody Mary at the same time. You do that for me. You get Gal Gadot to give me a blowjob. I'm going, hey, you know what? These guys are humanitarians. What? There's no apartheid here. I don't see any apartheid anywhere, because I'm holed up in the Hilton with an oceanfront view, and I got two twin supermodels that happen to be Jewish, and they're like, doing things for me. I'm going to say, you guys are super duper. You're awesome." And that's pretty much what the AIPAC tour is. You get some randy old congressman from Texas, take them to Bible country, let them see Jerusalem for 2 minutes, and you take them to the Israeli quarter, and that's it. You don't take them to where the Al-Aqsa mosque is. You just right. So these are the kind of things that drive me crazy when I hear these things. And you made the point a second ago. The right wing pushing a two-state solution to me, it sounds like that canard that you talked about a few months back. It's just a way to kind of deflect. Oh, hey, look over here. We're trying to get a two-state solution going, knowing full well that would never happen.
It won't happen because whatever, in my view, like there's this great line, I think I might have said this last time, Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu's father, when he was like 103 years old, right before the year before he died, it was an interview. And he said, and the interviewer said, do you think your son will offer the Palestinians a deal? And he said, oh, yes, sure. My son is going to offer the Palestinians a deal that they could never accept.
Wow.
And in a certain way, that was a truth statement, right? Because that's kind of where we are. Now, obviously, we have to look past Netanyahu, but the problem is that even when you go to someone like Benny Gantz, he's not really interested in it. I think that the Israelis have become tired of this whole idea of two states, and they just are not interested in it anymore.
Right.
And some of the young Palestinians are also saying, you know what? Let's just be part of Israel. Just give me a vote. Just make me a citizen.
Yeah.
Right. So
give me a living. Give me a living wage. Let me vote. Let me participate in the democracy that you all say you are.
Right. So that's always been the ace in the hole, and that still remains in the ace in the hole. And there's nothing that Kushner plan has done that has actually addressed that question.
No.
And I think that's why it's really a dead letter. Because it may benefit Israel economically. It may even benefit the Palestinians economically. I have no idea. But in terms of the question of self-determination, it does not address that question at all.
Oh,
that is ultimately, when it comes down to it, that really, for me anyway, that is the question. It's really not about Israel's future. It's about Israel's future as a democracy. And the interesting thing is there are many Israelis, increasingly so, that don't really care if Israel's a democracy or not.
Right.
I mean, the idea of, you hear many Israelis, people I know, friends that I know, oh, why are you venerating democracy? Democracy isn't the be-all and end-all of everything. I mean,
Sure.
There are people saying, well, maybe democracy isn't possible here.
Well, I think Goebbels said the same thing. This is where you get it. It goes down that rabbit hole, man. Because I mean, if you you can't just be a little democratic, right? You can't just be a little fascist, right? It's like you just it doesn't work that way. People in this country, in the United States, when they bitch about our democracy is being threatened. We've never been a democracy. By definition, it's always been a republic. Right. And we've had some democratic elements like we can vote, but then the electoral college trumps the popular vote, no pun intended. And that's happened twice this century. So, excuse me, it's a slippery slope rabbit hole. Hey, listen, in wrapping up, man, are you working on a new book or what's going on with you?
I am. I have a book that's now in the process of being produced, which is a cultural biography of Meir Kahane.
Okay.
It's called Meir Kahane, an American Jewish radical, because Kahane was in a certain sense. I focus a lot on his American career, but he's a reactionary militant rabbi who then goes to Israel and starts a political party that then gets ousted because it's considered to be racist. But he's actually was making arguments in the 1970s and the 1980s about Israel that actually have kind of come true in some weird way.
Sure.
I mean, he's a persona non grata because he was an advocate of violence, because he was a militant, because of his racist attitudes about Arabs and about blacks in America.
Sure.
But basically one of the things that he said that still resonates is that the Israeli left is mistaken if they think they're going to basically buy out the Palestinians. Like, the Palestinians are not going to give up their national aspirations for a washing machine. You're not going to be able to do that. Yeah. And in a certain sense, this is what Kahane's point was. I think that the Palestinians are as committed to their national project as the Jews are to theirs. And so you're not going to be able to buy them out. Just like you couldn't buy out the Jews, you're not going to buy out the Palestinians. So for him, it's a zero-sum game. So for him, it's like you have to actually kick all of them out.
Right.
Because you don't have the possibility of a Jewish state. And of course, that's rejected. But interestingly, we're coming around now, half a century later, and suddenly it's like, maybe there might be something to what he was saying. Not that you want to actually kick the Palestinians out.
No.
not clear whether this can actually work.
Right. Now, he was assassinated, right?
Assassinated. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, see, and then this gets to, kind of a last question before we actually kind of wrap up here. I mean, because my mind, I live in America, United States, right? Like I told you before, I don't have an emotional dog in this fight. To me, the logical, practical reason would not necessarily be a Palestinian state, but right of return, equal rights, the whole 9 yards. Is that in the minority of Palestinian thought, or do some Palestinians vibe with that? Because some of my Palestinian friends don't think that's a good idea. They want the whole thing.
I think, look, Abbas is still officially advocating 2 states. I think he kind of has to. But I think what Khalil Shakaki, who's the leading pollster in Palestine, has been saying, that among the younger generation of Palestinians, more and more of them are saying, look, we see 2 states is not going to happen. So we're just going to basically make an argument for 1 state. So, where that actually goes and how it goes, right? And the right of return is an interesting case, because Shakaki has polled a lot on that and said, if there was an open right of return, I mean, we brought him to Indiana University some years ago. He gave a great presentation. According, if Israel opened up the gates for a right of return, not that many Palestinians would actually come back. I mean, those that are living in the Gulf, those that are living in Europe, those that are living in the United States, those are living in Canada, those that are living in South America, most of them have been living there for generations. They're not going to basically pick up their lives and come back to 100%. Some Palestinian state or something like that, or to Israel. So, yeah, there will be a couple, tens of thousands, but not enough to really shift the demographic.
Right.
And I think Abbas has openly stated that he's open to a negotiated symbolic right of return, something that would allow the Palestinians to save face on that question.
Right.
I mean, but the problem is that the Israeli electorate is not interested in any of this. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And that's why there are 3 elections within a course of 12 months, and each time it becomes a little bit more and more right wing. That's where the Israeli electorate is, on the secular front and on the religious front.
Right.
So the question is, I don't know. I don't know whether there is anybody on the left that can demand the kind of respect and power to be able to do anything. So
it's going to have to be some. For want of a better example, it's going to have to be some like a Jeremy Corbyn type or a Bernie Sanders type that just captures the imagination of most of the population, to where they can't look and not have the guy be a sheepdog sellout, but somebody actually has some spine and will stand up for such a thing.
Look, there's a lot of people you see in Israel now. There are tens of thousands of people that are coming out to anti-Netanyahu demonstrations.
Sure, absolutely.
Right? And anti-occupation demonstrations. But I still don't think it really makes up a large enough contingency of the country, because you see in the elections, you have tens of thousands of people protesting him in Rabin Square, and then they have an elections and Likud wins again. So what does that actually, so what does that actually mean? In other words, it's a great groundswell, but it's just not enough to be able to turn the tide.
Right. Well, hey, man, appreciate you coming on as always. Big stuff to talk about in a little bit of time, but just like last time, you crushed it. So I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Always good to talk to you.
Absolutely. Folks, my guest has been Shaul Magid. And again, you can visit thebittertruth.info, and then you could, support the show there and everything. But I hope you got something out of this conversation today. And as always, if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to, sleep tight.